So we have this React application available at localhost port 5000. Now let's see how we can publish our application changes. So back to VS Code, we're going to go to the public directory and open index.html. Here I'm going to update the title of this app to Dockerized React App. This title is what we see in the browser window. So let's save the changes. Now back in the browser, if we refresh, we don't see anything. We still see the old title. So what should we do here? Well, for production machines, we should always build a new image, tag it properly, and then deploy it. We'll talk about that later when we get to the deployment section. But what about development machines? We don't want to rebuild the image every time we make a tiny change in our code. That's just too time consuming. Now you might say, what about copying? Well, that's a pain in the butt as well. We don't want to manually copy files from our development machine into a container every time we change our code. So let me show you a cool trick. We can create a mapping or a binding between a directory on the host and a directory inside the container. So this way, any changes we make to any files in this directory are immediately visible inside the container. So back to the terminal, we're going to start a new container. Docker run -d. This time I'm going to use a different port so we can distinguish it. We're going to map this port to port 3000. Now earlier we used a volume mapping. So we mapped the app data volume to /app/data directory inside the container. Now using the same syntax, we can map a directory on the host to a directory inside the container. So instead of using a named volume, which is a directory that Docker manages, we're going to use the current directory, the directory that holds our application. So we don't want to type the full path here. This is where we use the pwd command, print working directory. Now, if we execute this command as is, Docker thinks this is a named volume. We don't want that. We want a full path. So we're going to wrap this with a $sign and put it in parentheses. Now, when we execute this command, this part of the command will be evaluated first, and the result will be a full path to the current working directory. Then we're going to map this to not the data directory, we're going to map it to the app directory inside the container. Okay. Now, what about a named volume? Well, we can still add another option and use a named volume here if you want to, but this React application doesn't really store anything on the disk. It doesn't have a database. It's just a basic front-end application. So we don't need a named volume here. Now, let's add the image. Good. So here's the container ID. Let's look at the logs. This time I'm going to use the follow option so we can see the changes as they come up. Okay. We're waiting for the web server to start, so I'll be right back. All right, our web server is ready. So let's go to localhost port 5001. All right. We can certainly see the updated title. Now, let's make one more change to the application's code. So I'm going to add an exclamation mark at the end. Save the changes. Now, back in the browser, I didn't even have to refresh. Look, we've got the exclamation mark here. Because in React, we have this feature called hot reloading. So whenever we change any of our files, our application gets automatically reloaded in the browser. Okay. So to share our source code with a container, once again, we use the volume option to map the project directory to a directory in the container's file system. Now you might say, but Mosh, running applications with Docker is a pain in the ass. We have to remember all these options and type them every time we want to run an application. No, you don't. In the next section, we're going to talk about Docker Compose, and you will see how easy it is to bring up an application with multiple components. I had to cover all these commands and options, so when we get to the next section, you know exactly how Docker Compose works under the hood. So I will see you in the next section.